It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. He is the first speaker of this series, and quite frankly, I couldn't imagine a better speaker than Professor Llewelyn Morgan. Very briefly, a bio for him. Professor Morgan is Tutorial Fellow in Classics at Brasenose College and University of Oxford Lecturer in Classical Languages and Literature. He worked in Pennsylvania and the Republic of Ireland and studied in Oxford and Cambridge before coming to Brasenose College in 1997. His research interests are varied and rich, and he has a special interest in Roman literature, the study of coins, and also the Greeks in India and Afghanistan. Amongst his publications is this book, which he wrote, I think, about 10 years ago on the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And if you haven't read it already, I highly recommend it if you can get a copy of it. So please join me in welcoming very warmly Professor Llewelyn Morgan. Llewelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arzu. Thank you very much. Yes, whenever that 1997 date of turning up in Oxford comes up, it reminds me it's now 25 years, which is not a nice thing to remember. I mean, I don't blame you, Arzu. It's a while since I wrote about Bamiyan as well, and I've tried to keep up as much as I can, but I'll do the best I can. I'll take things a little bit beyond the 13th century as well towards the end, partly because I feel sort of increasingly more comfortable, despite being a classicist, the closer I get to now on this particular topic. But also because I think that's an important part of the story of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Anyway, to business. What are we talking about here? We're talking about two giant carved Buddhas in a cliff face in Afghanistan. A larger Buddha, which was 55 meters tall, a smaller, which was 38 meters tall. The larger was slightly later carved, and is generally regarded as more elegantly carved. The proportions are slightly more elegant, perhaps, and that's got a rather nice trefoil niche. Or it had. Sorry, I always have to talk in the past here. They were destroyed in 2001. A melancholy fact that we're all familiar with. Even before they were destroyed, and these are images from the 1970s, even before then, they lacked significant elements within them that were constructed from wooden armatures and clay. What's probably better understood paradoxically about the construction of the Buddhas since their destruction is how the clothing of the Buddhas was represented. There's a difference between these two Buddhas in the way that is done. So the smaller one, the one on the right as you look, the folds of the clothing are carved in the rock, which is then reflected in the clay that's overlaid. There's a much more kind of sophisticated system that was used on the larger Buddha, sort of involving a system of pegs connected by ropes over which clay was molded. So there are differences in technique between these two sculptures too. An obvious aspect of both of them is they don't have faces, or they don't have the upper part of faces, and there is some disagreement about what has happened there. It used to be assumed that that was just straightforward defacement in early Islamic times, But it's been suggested more recently that actually that might have been deliberately, the faces might have been deliberately left bare, and that faces, wooden faces, perhaps could have been sort of placed on the Buddhas. I mean, there's no way of really deciding between those options. Now, I'll probably forget to do this, though I shouldn't, and that's why I'm sort of saying this now. These photos have come from various sources. The photos I use have come from various sources, and when a photographer's photographs are first used, I put their names to the side. I'll come back to, I think, all of them in the course of what I say, but just a pointer to that. That's what names like Douglas Kell are doing as I move through. Okay, this is the point where I try and move slides. Let's try this. Okay, that's one way of doing it. It's slightly more laborious, but it gets us there. That first slide was a kind of a what, what am I talking about, which I probably didn't need to do, since what I'm talking about is reasonably well known. This is a where, which may also be well known, but is rather critical to an explanation of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. If we move from right to left and from south to north here, so starting in the bottom right hand corner, we have a close-in map of the valley of Bamiyan, with the two Buddhas at a certain distance away from each other. And Share Gogala marked there a medieval city, a fabulous photo of which by Jake Simkin is above. We move out a bit further, we see Bamiyan, another location. If you can see Shahreh Zahok there, which is a big castle at the entry to the Bamiyan Valley. That's the image on the left-hand side there of a mine clearer. All these places were mined in the Civil War, but it's a really sort of impressive construction. But further out, the Shiba Pass and various other passes connecting this very lush valley out of the Hindu Kush Mountains, or across the Hindu Kush Mountains, into other valleys. It's a sort of it's a contained space, a very lush space surrounded by mountains. That's clearer in the sort of larger scale map of, sorry, I always get that wrong, in the sort of biggest space map of all, showing you where Bamiyan is in the middle of the block of mountains in the center of Afghanistan. Holditch in the Gates of India, who had a serious interest in knowing what was what on the borders of British India. That was kind of his job, but has a good remark on this, that a confined narrow ribbon of space such as Bamiyan, difficult of access, placed by nature in the heart of a wilderness, should have been the center not only of a great kingdom, but the focus of a great religion, would be inexplicable if we did not remember that through it runs the connecting link between the wealth of India and the great cities of the Oxus Plains and Central Asia. This is a classic example of a place in between, a peripheral place, which is critical if you want to get from A to B, and there are, as Holditch suggests, good reasons to get from A to B. It also, its position makes of it a melting pot. Still, it's a remarkable, the Hindu Kush is a remarkable sort of collection of creeds and peoples. In the Buddhist period in Bamiyan, an essentially Iranian people followed an essentially Indian religion, and may have written their Iranian language in Greek script as well. So the very definition of a melting pot. We have things at work. Okay, well, another amazing photo by Jake Simkin here, just giving you a sense of the kind of the sweep of the valley. This is post-destruction, though you wouldn't be able to see the Buddhas even even before they were destroyed. But you can see the two large niches and quite what a distance they are. What you can also, I hope, see is that the cliff face around the Buddhas is peppered with caves. Those caves themselves are of great interest. They're architecturally very complex. They're decorated with paintings in many cases, and a great deal of study has been done on them, which I don't really have time to talk about here. Other representations of the valley coming from the other direction at the top and slightly impressionistic. This is a drawing by a hostage in 1842, a British hostage called prisoner, if you prefer, called Vincent Eyre, who we'll come back to. And then underneath an Afghan to Afghani banknote from 1939, where Bamiyan is represented, and it's quite an interesting moment. It's a moment when Bamiyan is starting to be used as an expression of national identity, as a symbol of the Afghan state. Before we stop the what and the where, though, personally, you can tell me that something is 55 meters tall or something is 38 meters tall, and it doesn't really sort of compute for me. So some attempt to give the impression of how very large these statues were. On the left-hand side is something from the Illustrated London News, a rather brilliant article by William Simpson, in which he kind of imagined all the big statues of the world coming together, and all of them, at least all the ones he chose, were awed by the Buddhas of Bamiyan. They were so large. It's the Illustrated London News, though, so he does give us the London monument as a monument that's even larger than the Buddhas of Bamiyan. But if you're familiar, if anybody's familiar with the London Monument, this is the monument commemorating the Great Fire of London. They're very, very tall indeed. However, even better, I think, is a photo sent to me by a lovely man called Edmund Meltzel, who's unfortunately died in the last decade. But he, as a kid, came with his father to Afghanistan. They were German, and were involved in building a factory for processing cotton, I think. And at the weekends, the Germans would drive up in their Beetles, in some cases, up to Bamiyan. And on one occasion, this photo was taken. This is the first of a series of photos that there are in this presentation involving cars and the Buddhas. I don't know why cars and the Buddhas go so well together, but they do seem to. However, that does quite effectively convey how large the larger Buddha is, and the smaller Buddha is not much smaller. So they were very, very big. We get a lot further in understanding how they looked, and to some extent what they meant in the Buddhist period at Bamiyan, through the words of Xuan Zhang, a Chinese monk who passed through, to our great good fortune, quite shortly after the second larger Buddha was created. Now is probably a time, might have been earlier, to talk a bit about the date, or talk very rapidly about the date. Something else that's been possible to do since the destruction is take organic fragments from both Buddhas and date them. And so we do seem to have reasonably, with reasonable confidence, dates of about 550 CE for the smaller Buddha, and about 615 CE for the larger Buddha. Xuanzang comes through Bamiyan in about 630, so not long after either has been constructed. What he's doing is traveling from China, from the capital of Tang, China, in pursuit of original Buddhist texts. And in the process, he becomes a truly iconic figure in China and beyond, a figure of enormous significance in broader culture and in literature. What he also is, in his account of things, is generally a very dependable witness, a very dependable describer of the places he moves through. His descriptions of distances, for example, have been vindicated fairly consistently. I say that because we're about to encounter a moment where we are bound to doubt the information that he gives us. To summarize what he is telling us here, he's talking about the people of Bamiyan. He tells us that Buddhism is dominant in the place, though he also tells us that there are other. It seems to tell us that there are other religions that are observed here. He mentions merchants, which is critical. We're in a place here where Buddhism is Buddhist monastic life is very much at home. It is a remote place, but it's also a place that's on important trade routes, and the association of Buddhism and trade, Buddhism and trade is really very strong. He indicates the particular school of Buddhism that's dominant in Bamiyan, and then he starts to describe the Buddhas and the Buddhas in particular, but then other details of the scene. To the northeast of the royal city, there is a mountain, on the declivity of which, on the slope of which, is placed a stone figure of Buddha, erect in height 140 or 150 feet. Its golden hues sparkle on every side, and its precious ornaments dazzle the eyes by their brightness. To the east of this spot, there is a convent which was built by a former king of the country. To the east of the convent, there is a standing figure of Shakya Buddha made of metallic stone, a slightly sort of strange term, in height a little smaller. It has been cast in different parts and joined together, and thus placed in a completed form as it stands. To the east of the city, there is a convent in which there is a figure of Buddha lying in a sleeping position as when he attained nirvana. The figure is in length about 1,000 feet or so. And then he goes on to describe a ritual which seems to suggest some quite subtle interaction between spiritual and secular power in this location. Well, Xuanzang's detailed description of the Buddhas is not, of the standing Buddhas, is not entirely accurate as it stands, but what it communicates is how intensely decorated they must have been. And we'll say a little bit more about how they were painted later, but there would be multiple other ways in which they could be decorated. The matter of the 1,000-foot Buddha is quite notorious. There are various theories about what may be happening here, but it's most likely that there's some kind of problem with the text of Xuanzang at this point. If we move on, this is not a Buddha from Bamiyan. This is a Buddha from Ajina Tepe in Tajikistan. It's now in the museum in Dushanbe. It's a powerful representation of the Buddha, the parinirvana, so dying, so approaching the final nirvana that comes with death. That's what Xuanzang was describing in that, when he was talking about that 1,000-foot Buddha that we sort of believe never existed. What has been found at Bamiyan since 2001 is the remains of a not quite 1,000-foot reclining Buddha, but a 19-meter reclining Buddha, and it's there beneath the Buddha cliffs. So actually, when I went, it was both times I went, it had been covered over out of the archaeological season. So there is a Buddha of this kind somewhere in the vicinity of where Xuanzang was talking. Now, Xuanzang gives us a very busy scene in Bamiyan. We can supplement that ourselves a little bit in addition to his description. I think it's easy enough to imagine. You can see caves in the background there, and there are caves all the way kind of along the cliffs and indeed down the valleys, the adjacent valleys as well. We can imagine wooden constructions added to the cliff face and stairways and movement possible across the cliff face. There will also have been lots and lots of buildings that no longer survive in the valley itself. One which survives a little bit at any rate is what you can see on the screen there, which is the remains of a stupa, which it's possible to conclude from later Islamic sources was quite a spectacular building when in its original form. I've stepped out of Afghanistan entirely and given you a model from the Museum of Swat there, but that is a reasonably comparable impression of what a stupa might have looked like. And the image at the bottom is just to convey how enormous, potentially enormous, the parasols, the chatras stacked above the stupa might be. These are indications of royalty, so implying the importance of what is represented by the stupa. And what is represented by the stupa is, roughly speaking, something rather like what is represented by the dying Buddha. These are sepulchral monuments, sort of expressions of the Buddha in death, perhaps, or commemorating his death and his ultimate achievement of nirvana. I didn't say this when we were looking at images of the Buddha, but we are in a seismically very active part of the world here. Such damage as has been done to the Buddhas is mainly to be attributed to earthquakes, I think. Wherever in this part of the world you put up a structure like this with very massive stone chatras, the chances of them being brought down by an earthquake is quite major. An Italian archaeologist is, at my insistence, giving scale to one of these in Swat. Okay, semi-finally on the appearance of things. This is an image of the Buddha from Mesa Aynak, a very important archaeological site elsewhere in Afghanistan, where Buddhist monasteries are associated with a copper mine, essentially. Very much an example of Buddhism and commerce being closely connected. This image, to me, seems to be quite like the slightly top-heavy character of the larger Buddha. I think this is how we might imagine him, and certainly the clothing that he's wearing would have been represented on both Buddhas, but on the larger Buddha in a more elaborate way. What we also find in the Islamic sources, though, is a very consistent description of the two Buddhas as the white idol and the red, the Hing But and the Surkh But. To the extent that the poet Ansori in the 11th century wrote a romance about these two idols, and I think the story is essentially that there were two lovers who eventually were kind of buried in this location. But much more recently, again, research done since the destruction of the Buddhas has established with a remarkable degree of accuracy, actually, or a remarkable degree of detail, I assume accuracy as well, that the Buddhas were enjoyed a kind of a sequence of paintings. But at the end, the smaller Buddha remained painted essentially white, and the larger Buddha had a new more, it had another sort of painting, and ended up red. So whether or not, you know, late in, and they continue to call the red and the white Buddha for a very long time, indeed, it just becomes their name. But at an early point in Islamic Bamiyan, or post-Buddhist Bamiyan, let's say, they probably did still retain that colouring. Finally, in the Buddhist period, at any rate, there are images. There is painting throughout the caves. Some of the most interesting and complex was above the smaller Buddha. All of it was destroyed in the explosions of 2001, of course. On the left-hand side is what was sort of above the Buddha in the soffit of the alcove, and it's a very intriguing image of a male figure on a chariot associated with the sun, who looks a lot like Mitra, who looks a lot like, in other words, a Zoroastrian deity. And that, you know, that's entirely plausible given where we are. It confirms the impression we might assume, I suppose, that that anywhere in the Hindu Kush is going to involve an encounter of very varied beliefs. What was also represented in the same niche were images of apparently royal figures worshipping the Buddha. and they've been assumed to represent the ruling dynasty of Bamiyan. We know very, very little. In fact, as much as we know about them, you've already seen, I think, about who was actually in charge. What we do feel that we can probably say is that, well, first of all, this must have been an extremely prosperous place. It's only a very prosperous place that could undertake not just the carving of the Buddhas, but the use of wood in great number to create the full effect of the Buddhas. Also, that there must have been a degree of sort of peace and to go with the to go with the prosperity and to reinforce the prosperity. There was a period of time where we roughly coinciding with the construction of the Buddhas. I believe historically, I'm a little bit on thin ice here. I think it's both too late for me and too early, but I think you have a dominant presence in the Western Turks, who have as much control as they might have of various polities through the Hindu Kush. So you have a kind of an overall control and peace, but also great potential for kind of independent sort of activity and projects. Okay, I'm moving on from the Buddhist period now, although what we're still looking at here is, well, in a sense, telling us about religious practice in this valley when it was Buddhist, and specifically here the impact of the Buddhas. I'll explain what we're looking at though, because it's a remarkable document. The Firist is a kind of catalogue of literature and learning as it might be known in Baghdad in the 10th century. It's an incredible thing to have, I think. In this particular section, which is quite confused, it's fair to say, we're having shared with us information about India, broadly defined, secured through the offices of Yahya al-Barmaki, who was the vizier of Harun al-Rashid in that kind of heyday of the Abbasid dynasty. I'll talk a bit more about him in a second, but let's look what he has to say. As I say, it is rather confusing, but the most useful moment is where it says, the people of India go on pilgrimages to these two idols, bearing with them offerings, incense and fragrant woods. If the eye should fall upon them from a distance, a man would be obliged to lower his eyes, overawed by them. If he is lacking in attention or careless when he sees them, it is necessary for him to return to a place from which he cannot view them, and then to approach them, seeking them as an object of his attention with reverence for them. Which is an interestingly kind of sympathetic view of something that is, fundamentally alien to an Islamic way of thinking. A fascinating thing to be being read about in Baghdad. Now, Yahya al-Barmaki is a very, very interesting person. He's at the heart of a family that will, have a period of great influence in the Abbasid state. He's also the grandson of somebody who was a Buddhist abbot of a large monastery in Balkh, to the north of the Hindu Kush, an important sort of point of contact with Bamiyan. So this family has both converted to Islam and become very significant within the ruling regime, but is active also in that sort of extraordinary acquisition of knowledge that was happening at this time. Their particular talent, which is natural for a family that originates in this part of the world, being for bringing knowledge from India, and in the wider context, I think we're talking about sort of medicinal knowledge, sort of being brought from India and brought from India into the kind of Islamic space. As a first encounter between the first encounter that we're aware of between Islam and the Buddhas, though this is obviously a very sympathetic one. Onsori, who I mentioned earlier with his romance about the white idol and the red idol, is a roughly similar time, and he's at the court of Mahmud of Ghazni, which may sort of correct certain sort of assumptions about things. Well, in 2001, as we know, the Buddhas were blown up by the Taliban on the principle that all the statues must be destroyed so that no one can worship or respect them in the future, as the words of Mullah Omar. Yet it's obviously the case that Bamiyan, having been converted to Islam gradually between the 8th and the 10th century, perhaps. Despite this, the Buddhas survived essentially intact. I mean, I've suggested that I think most of the damage to the Buddhas, most of the significant damage to the Buddhas is a matter of earthquakes rather than anything else. Essentially intact for more than 1,000 years, which implies an essentially comfortable coexistence between Islam and these Buddhist constructions. How this might have been done, what the thinking might have been about these strange and massive pagan survivals, is worth a little bit more attention, though, and I'll give it some. This text by Tusi, The Wonders of Nature, is a work of cosmography, an account of the universe, which finds its way in various complicated ways to discussing images like the Buddhas of Bamiyan. But it's fascinating that ultimately what he says about these images is the way he explains these images as evidence of God's providential, wondrously providential construction of the world. Here's a lovely, not very accurate, but nevertheless lovely story of how when the sun shines, the Buddhas smile. Why? Well, God knows this. An even less accurate representation of the Buddhas underneath from I think a 14th century manuscript of this work. What also happens is that the Buddhas are associated more directly with Islamic belief, but in such a way as to endorse, or at least not overtly contradict, orthodox belief. I have a little chunk here written by Sultan Muhammad, who's a scholar from Balkh, who's come over the mountains from Balkh, a vivid a little anecdote. Who, I'll read a bit of it, but he wonders out loud if the Buddhas represent false gods, but leaves it again to God to decide. So the writer of these words, when he was headed for Kabul from the city of Balkh, came to this place on the 14th of Rabi al-Thani in the year 935. As a result of wind and of rain, Bamiyan is quite inclement in winter, as we can probably imagine. The caravan took refuge in the niche of the male idol. The male idol is the larger Buddha, the female idol, the smaller Buddha. I recall that the caravan had close to 200 horses, and 100 men with the camels and mules were contained in this niche, and another group of about 300 men and horses and tents found rest in the other niche of the female idol. And near to these two idols, two small idols are carved in the rock. One is in the appearance of a slave girl, and the other in the appearance of a slave boy. In the book Jahan Nama, it is said that these two huge idols are Yakut and Yauk, that is Allah on high, who knows. Another opportunity to associate a car with the larger Buddha. You probably think I'm cheating because I keep choosing very small cars, and this is a 2CV, but I present what I'm given. Again, carefully positioned between the feet, though not quite as close as the beetle was. The book on the left-hand side, lovely little book written by Ahmad Ali Kozad, after Ria Haqqan, who, like Kozad, had been involved in the archaeological excavations of the French in Afghanistan between the wars, between the First War and the Second World War. This was published after Ria Haqqan had been killed in the Second World War. But it collects together myths across Afghanistan, and in association with Bamiyan, a dominant myth associates the Buddhas with the conversion of Bamiyan to Islam by mythologically by Hazrat Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, and the Shias, who are the majority of the population in Bamiyan, the first imam. So there's an interesting respect in which the Buddhas become sort of entirely acceptable because they commemorate the conversion of the space to Islam. Right, I need to get my skates on, so I'm going to move through. We've jumped ahead here to the beginnings of the modern celebrity of the Buddhas. I'm going to suggest, if I get that far, that the Buddhas of Bamiyan have never been so celebrated, have never been so famous as they have been since they were destroyed in 2001, actually. But they did achieve a kind of global celebrity after the 19th century, from the 19th century onwards. By the 1970s, if you were lucky enough to go to Afghanistan, you had to go to Bamiyan, hence all these photos I'm able to share. Arguably, that was the case in the 1880s as well, though. It had become one of those kind of places that you had to see. Now, if we can trace this anywhere, we can trace it to a very strange individual called Francis Wilford, who was based at Varanasi in India, but sent a surveyor, Mughal Beg, to investigate territory beyond the control of the East India Company. And on the basis of this information, on the basis of that information and various other information that he brought to bear, Wilford wrote some wildly speculative articles, including his most famous, which is called On Mount Caucasus, which is dated to 1799, really, really unhinged stuff, this, but really quite influential as well, and understandably kind of happening in a moment when there's great sort of intellectual activity in Calcutta amongst the British operatives of the East India Company, and it all gets a bit sort of out of control. Well, in the case of Wilfrid, he quite confidently concluded at the end of a terrifically sort of complex argument on Mount Caucasus that Bamiyan was the location of the Garden of Eden. And here you have a document from not very much later agreeing with him, essentially. Soberer assessments ensued, it's fair to say. Alexander Thoma de Koroush was the first European that we know of to visit Bamiyan. He walked through at the turn of 1821 and 1822. He was the first to recognize it, first European to recognize it as a Buddhist site as well, but we have to sort of follow him a little bit to understand why he did this. He's quite an odd individual as well. He's a Hungarian who decided to walk across Asia to find the homeland of the Hungarians. But he got kind of distracted in the vicinity of Ladakh and spent a lot of time in Ladakh reading Tibetan material, and is generally credited as the inventor of Tibetology. He's that significant. Having discovered as much as he did discover about Buddhism, he was able to look back to what he'd seen when he walked through Bamiyan in 1821, 1822, and realized that it was actually a Buddhist site. In the following 20 years after Alexander Thoma de Koroush, a motley crew of Europeans and Americans visited Bamiyan. There were spies, deserters, mercenaries, you name it. But in particular, there was the hostage or the prisoner that I mentioned earlier. Vincent Eyre was taken prisoner during the famous retreat of the British during the First Anglo-Afghan War from Kabul to Jalalabad. A very small number of British or British Indian troops, Indian commanded by British, actually survived that retreat. But a number of them were taken hostage by the Afghans and were progressively moved away from a British army that was coming back into Afghanistan to take revenge. So they were picked up, walked back, ultimately walked back to Kabul, and then pushed further up to Bamiyan. And they're sitting here in Bamiyan, sort of wondering what will happen to them, essentially. On this evidence, they're fairly relaxed about it. What Eyre does, Lieutenant Eyre does, is, well, in his own words, I ascended to the top of the female image, to the smaller Buddha, by a series of stairs and galleries, the labour of excavating which through solid rock must have been immense. From the main gallery, others branched off in all directions, communicating with distant chambers. While sitting on the lady's crown, enjoying a splendid view of the country, I've given you images which I think are from the top of the smaller Buddha, as you will understand. I haven't myself sat on the top of the smaller Buddha because it wasn't there when I started working on Bamiyan. But if it is, you have an image from the 1920s at the top and from the 1970s at the bottom. And as I say, Eyre is there in 1842, at least I think I said that. While sitting there anyway, enjoying splendid view, I was joined by some of the inhabitants who were very inquisitive to know what was written in our books concerning the place. And here Eyre betrays a sort of a very, very sort of common preoccupation of Europeans when they are in this part of the world. I told them that it was generally supposed that Alexander the Great founded a city there. And he goes on to say that that went down extremely well, because everybody knew about Alexander the Great. And then they went on to say that they only wished that the British would stay in control of Afghanistan thereafter. Okay, well, we can doubt parts of that. I'm approaching the end of what I have to say here, but that's from the same. This is from the same source of photographs as the upper image of the previous screen. The larger Buddha again, and a rather fine 1920s Wolseley car, the suspension of which must be in a fairly treacherous state by the time they've got where they've got to. This is here just to sort of illustrate that into the 20th century, this is about 1926 or something like that, into the 20th century, Bamiyan remains a must-see destination for the adventurous. This car is associated with the British mission in Kabul. Douglas Kell, whose photos I've been showing, and Mike Letchford, whose photos I've also been showing, travelled on the hippie trail in the early 1970s in both cases, I think. And when I was publicising my book a very long time ago now, a lovely experience I had repeatedly was people coming up afterwards very shamefacedly saying, I've got some photos of Bamiyan, the Buddhas of Bamiyan with me, would you like to see? I'm sure you wouldn't like to see them. And of course I was sort of jumping at their photos because as I explained to them, I've never seen the Buddhas of Bamiyan. I came to it 7 or 8 years after they'd been destroyed. If anybody watching has any images of the Buddhas of Bamiyan and has any kind of, sort of feels any resistance to sharing them, please digitize them. And if you'd like to send them to me, I'd be delighted, but just make sure they are preserved somewhere. Finally, just to sort of wrap things up, and I mean, this is a little bit dark, but this is to reinforce the thought I expressed earlier that the celebrity of the Buddhas of Bamiyan has been greatest, paradoxically, since they've been destroyed. Because I think since 2001, Bamiyan has become a kind of meme. It's become shorthand for destruction of cultural heritage. It was something we heard a lot, that what was done to shrines and books in Timbuktu was another Bamiyan, and what was done in Palmyra by Daesh was another Bamiyan. That's, as it were, one side of things, but it's fairly clear as well, I think, that the destruction of the Buddhas was an inspiration for others too, others who learned from Bamiyan the impact that could be achieved by destroying ancient monuments. To the left there, you have a Buddha in Pakistan, in Swat. In Pakistan, the Buddha of Shakurai, also known as the Buddha of Jahanabad, which was attacked and defaced and largely destroyed in 2007 by the Taliban, and has been meticulously reconstructed by Pakistani and Italian experts. Now, it has to be done meticulously because it's designed to be seen from a particular position underneath it. So the whole, to recreate it and get the perspective right is an incredibly tricky business. Another image of Lokateshvara there at the museum, in the middle of the museum of Swat, Saudi Sharif, which was blown up by the Taliban into multiple pieces and has been reconstructed. The attack on the Buddha at Jahanabad at Shakurai was begun on September the 11th, 2007, I believe. So kind of all kinds of dates associated with stuff get combined here. Finally, though, and the reason why there's an image of Putin in the theatre in Palmyra, if you want to claim to represent civilized Western values, however you want them to describe this, one thing you can do is hold a concert of classical music in a classical theatre where Daesh had recently staged atrocities. There is a dialogue associated with a dialogue, the terms of which are the destruction or the preservation of monuments. And it seems to me it's a very contemporary dialogue. It seems to me it was inaugurated by Bamiyan, this dialogue between protectors, or in this case, obviously claimed protectors. I'm in no way endorsing what Putin is suggesting here, or destroyers of them on the other side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Llewelyn, for this fascinating talk, which has kept the interest of 200 people throughout your entire 1 hour talk, and still
Excellent.
Another 140 or so right through to the Q&A, end of the Q&A. So thank you so much. Thank you to all our participants for coming. And just to say a shout out for next week, where we will actually look at Bamiyan as a region and as an agricultural entrepot, if you want, a few centuries after the arrival of Islam. So we hope to see many of you there, and wish you a wonderful week. Until then, next week, same time, same place. Thank you. Bye.